Hello, I'm Fraser Myers, Deputy Editor of Spiked. This week, Peter Murrell, the former Chief Executive of the Scottish National Party, pled guilty to embezzling around £400,000 of his own party funds. There's been some rather enjoyable headlines about his spending spree on everything from camper vans to Jaguars to luxury salt and pepper pots. I'm delighted to be joined to discuss this by Ian McWhirter, columnist at The Times and The Spectator, and one of the great commentators on Scottish politics. Ian, first of all, shall we just talk a little bit about this extraordinary shopping spree? Because people will have seen the camper van come up several years ago when the police investigation began, but we really have uncovered some quite extraordinary details thanks to this guilty plea.
Well, yeah, his and hers watches worth £4,500 each. Fountain pens worth £2,000, a lot of them. A whole succession of high-end coffee-making machines, even a very expensive lawnmower. And that's apart from the high-end, the lead items, obviously, which were the £125,000 he spent on a Niesman and Bischoff superior camper van, which apparently he never used. He just left it at in his mother's driveway. And of course, his Jaguar, which he purchased for £81,000 with money from the SNP, and bought other vehicles as well. So, but there's a whole catalogue of high-end tat from expensive stores like Fortnum & Mason's that you would and Lalique, you'd never expect this relatively, apparently modest Scottish couple to be living this kind of lifestyle. And that's what people find extremely hard to believe, and why until very recently people were just not prepared to accept that Peter Murrell was actually corrupt, was actually a kleptomaniac, and was embezzling large sums of their own members' money.
And the spotlight has turned to Nicola Sturgeon in recent days. There was this fantastic I think it was the Daily Record front page, which mocked her up as Manuel from Fawlty Towers, saying, "I know nothing." She, of course, denies any wrongdoing, but I think a lot of people are within their rights to ask, how did she not notice this extraordinary spending happening within the same household as her?
Well, interesting, she's trying to close down speculation about her knowledge or involvement by setting her lawyer, Amar Anwar, around the editorial offices, making threats of defamation. As the leader of the Scottish Conservatives put it yesterday in Parliament, he said it's just a preposterous proposition that she could not have known about the criminal enterprise of her husband over 12 years when they lived together and when he was purchasing all these items. Now, the police did question Nicola Sturgeon at great length. There's some question today, actually. The Sun is claiming that in her police interview, she refused to comment. Nevertheless, the police did totally exonerate her. She's not accused of reset, which is the legal term for benefiting materially from embezzled goods. So she's in the clear legally. But obviously, in the court of public opinion, there is profound skepticism, and people just keep asking themselves, all this jewelry, all these bags, all these pens that she was seen using, did she never ask, where did they come from? How did they afford them?
Absolutely. And is there, you've alluded to the hypocrisy of the Peter Murrell and Nicola Sturgeon presenting themselves as modest. They do have a fairly modest home on the outside for a power couple, essentially some of the most powerful people in Scotland. Nicola Sturgeon has also been careful to paint herself as a very progressive, saintly figure, a woman of the people. This can't help but really call into question that image that she's tried to cultivate for herself.
Well, yeah, obviously her image has been in fairly steep decline since she resigned precipitately in February 2023 after the collapse of her gender recognition reform bill, which of course indirectly led to male-bodied rapists being placed in women's prisons. That was a huge crisis for her, as was the Supreme Court's rejection of her suit, her claim that the Scottish Parliament should have the right to hold an independence referendum. Now, everyone assumed at the time that, these were the reasons why she went suddenly without anyone really expecting it. Now people are beginning to look more closely at the timeline because, of course, the original complaints about this £600,000, which some SNP activists said had not been used for the correct purposes, which was it was ring-fenced to finance a referendum campaign that never happened. A number of activists made complaints to the police saying, what happened to this money? That was in 2021. And so who knows? It may have played in the background, it may have played, may have been a factor in her decision to go. But yes, she was, if you remember COP26 in 2020, when she was really in her pomp, she was seen as Britain's answer to Jacinda Ardern, because of course Nicola Sturgeon was not just a highly successful politician in Scotland. She was the darling of the UK liberal progressive media elite. She was like kind of the Justin Trudeau of UK politics, and her protestations, her condemnations of plutocracy, which she made repeatedly in speeches, now sound distinctly hollow when we find out that her husband was living the life that's more associated with selling sunset than a modest new build in Uddingston. So I mean, her reputation has suffered enormously. But I think it's worth just stressing how important this couple was to recent Scottish and UK history, because you've got to remember, as a duopoly, he was the chief executive of the Scottish National Party. She was the SNP First Minister. Between them, they dominated Scottish politics for a decade. And arguably, during that decade, she came fairly close to precipitating the breakup of Britain. If you remember, in 2015, the midpoint of her husband's magpie-like kleptomania, she delivered in her under her leadership in the general election there. She returned 56 SNP MPs. This was the general election. 56 MPs out of 59. I mean, no one will ever equal that. And many people, even in the Conservative benches in Westminster, while they rejected her call for another referendum or negotiations on independence, nevertheless, they were thinking, well, this can't really go on indefinitely. You can't have these massive votes in favor of leaving the UK without there being some kind of response from the centre. So these are tremendously significant figures, not just for Scottish politics, but for UK politics as well. And their downfall, obviously, has made independence seem a less likely threat.
Now, if you're a fan of this YouTube channel, I'm sure you love Rod Liddle. Certainly all of us at Spiked do. You may have seen his recent brilliant interview with Brendan O'Neill about the Labour leadership contenders and what a shower they all are. But if you want to get more of Rod Liddle, if you can't get enough Rod, then every Saturday from 10 a.m, Rod actually takes over Times Radio for 3 hours of spiky conversation, humour and opinion, and he's always confronting topics head on. Rod poses the big questions to big name interviewees, ones that won't just give you the line you've heard everywhere else. And it's not all heavy lifting. You'll also get music recommendations from leading artists and a weekly TV review that lets you know exactly what to watch and what to avoid. So, join Rod Liddle on Times Radio, Saturdays from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. on digital radio, on your smart speaker, or by downloading the free Times Radio app. To what extent would it be fair to say that this kind of, perhaps, maybe the criminal part is not representative, but this kind of sleaziness may be emblematic of the SNP more broadly? I mean, there are accusations that the SNP acts as a kind of McMafia, or that it rules Scotland like a very aloof clique. There are, allegations that where does the civil service begin and the Scottish National Party end? Accusations of influencing the judiciary and the police force, things like that. To what extent do we have a problem there with the Scottish National Party?
Well, any party that dominates a legislature for 20 years, remember the SNP won its first general Scottish election victory in 2007, so it's been in office for nearly 2 decades. It's just won another election, in fact, its 5th successive election. So when you have a party in power for that length of time, then inevitably it becomes, well, prone to what happens in one-party states. I'm not suggesting that Scotland is a one-party state in the communist sense, but clearly the people in charge tend to see themselves as permanent fixtures. And that's very much what happened here, because many people in the SNP, including Nicola Sturgeon's predecessor, Alex Salmond, said that this duopoly, this control of the SNP and the Scottish government by the Murrells, by Nicola Sturgeon and her husband, Peter Murrell, who was a very influential figure, this was extremely unhealthy for democracy and damaging for the Scottish National Party long term. And I think he's been vindicated in his criticisms there, because Peter Murrell went to great lengths to close down investigation into the finances of the Scottish National Party. People were puzzled about this. A number of figures like the National Treasurer, Douglas Chapman, he resigned in 2021 because he just wasn't getting the information he needed. Similarly, Joanna Cherry KC, a prominent lawyer, nationalist MP, had been trying to get information about the finances and was being blocked and was eventually sacked from her front bench role. So you can see that there was certainly very tight control, centralized control on this political party, which was also dominating Scottish politics for a very, very long time. And that, I think, is now accepted to have been profoundly unhealthy, not least because of what was happening behind the scenes that nobody realized.
And do you think this will do long-term damage to the SNP? As you just said, they have just won another election, the Scottish Parliament elections. The people have maybe slightly conspiratorially asked questions about the timing of these revelations and the court date. But this does feel like a big bombshell. Will it damage the SNP? Can anything damage the SNP to the extent that it would perhaps not lead the next Scottish government?
Well, I mean, as you imply there, a number of people are saying, well, hang on. If he had made this plea in the High Court of Justiciary last month rather than this month, would the SNP actually have won that election? Because, I mean, it did win the election, but with a much reduced vote. It lost about 10% of its voting support. The turnout was very low. Only about half of Scots voted in this election, and he lost any chance of getting an absolute majority, which he had. This is John Swinney I'm talking about, the First Minister. He had forecast that he would get something like 65 out of 129 MSPs. He didn't succeed in doing that. Now, if this revelation had come just a few weeks earlier, I cannot help thinking that this extraordinary lurid publicity about this catalogue of gifts and crazy items and extravagant spending would have damaged the SNP's electoral chances very profoundly. And of course, questions are now being raised about another factor here, which is in Scotland, unlike in England, the Lord Advocate, the head of the prosecution service, is actually a political appointee who serves in the cabinet. And this was one, Dorothy Bain, who has just stood down, in fact, and was heavily criticized earlier this year because she gave, or appeared to give, advanced warning of some of the nature of the charges that Peter Murrell was facing to the First Minister, John Swinney. Now, she says it's perfectly normal to give updates on important cases to the First Minister of Scotland. Nevertheless, people are now saying, well, that's it. We can't keep having the head of the prosecution service being a political appointee in the cabinet because there's a clear conflict of interest there. So, I mean, this has profound ramifications. I mean, people were expecting that Peter Murrell was going to suffer some kind of retribution, though people were unaware of and I was completely unaware of the extent of. We'd heard about the camper van issue, but you see, that was explained at the time by saying, well, they needed a battle bus to use during COVID when the people were in lockdown. So that seemed a plausible explanation. And also some of the items that were being speculated about all these expensive watches and things like that. A £3,500 wine coaster in Britannia silver. I mean, anyone who knows Peter Morrill, I knew him for a very long time, would find that extraordinary, because he never gave any impression, the remotest impression, that he was interested in such fancy goods. I mean, and some of us, I kind of thought, well, maybe some of these were donations given by foreign, because like the Lalique salt and pepper shakers, which were worth, I think it was 3,000 or 2,600 pounds. I mean, it's the kind of thing that you might, a civic dignitary, a foreign leader might give to a party, a political leader during a visit. These kind of exchanges do take place. They have, of course, to be fully declared, and I don't know whether these were declared or not. But anyway, it's irrelevant, because the way the story has been presented by the police was that Peter Morrill, the chief executive of the Scottish National Party, plundered his membership's funds, their donations made in good faith over the years, often very poor people donating to the Scottish National Party. He used them to finance what they call is a lavish lifestyle, which his own income could not support. So we have to accept what is being said, that he had this strange hyper-consumerism, this strange acquisitiveness, which perhaps took place maybe below the level of visibility, though. I mean, it's hard to believe that the sheer volume of these goods and their extraordinary quality. I mean, hundreds of video game consoles, for example. I mean, expensive lawnmowers. I mean, spent £110 on a pencil sharpener. This is the kind of thing that you would not expect any Scottish national politician to be remotely interested in acquiring, but apparently this was the case with Peter Morrill. And I mean, it was an extraordinarily risky thing for him to do, because how did he think he was ever going to get away with it? Maybe that's the problem. People in power begin to think that they're, above the law, they're above public opinion, and they can do what they want. And that's the danger of a one-party state.
And finally, what implications might this have for Scottish independence? I mean, it is notable that these the first questions were raised by people who were campaigning for independence. There is clearly a big split among independence activists, many of whom will now utterly resent the SNP, despite that being, the party of independence, clearly the electoral force that is most capable of delivering it.
Well, I think that's in some ways the most interesting aspect, or one of the most interesting aspects of this affair, which is that it was broken open by nationalists themselves. It was originally it was an SNP activist called Sean Clerkin who made the original complaint to the police in 2021, asking what had happened to the £600,000 that had been collected assembled for this referendum campaign that didn't take place. Thereafter, the questions were all raised internally by auditors, by national treasurers, by MPs like Joanna Cherry Casey, who were legally trained and were desperately trying to get at the truth. The other parties, perhaps for their own reasons, because, but for the grace of God go they, were keeping a bit apart from this. They were kind of waiting to see what happened, because they couldn't really believe it either. They just didn't, they didn't think that Nicola Sturgeon would entertain a partner. She is estranged from Peter Morrill now, but they lived together for 12 years. Are married, obviously, and she claims he was the love of her life, and says she's been betrayed and she's deeply hurt by what's happened. But the other parties were kind of really sort of went along with that. They didn't really think this was plausible either. This guy who has this very downbeat, very ordinary demeanor, dumpy bank manager type image, would have any aspirations to this kind of extravagant lifestyle. So anyway, so what I mean is that this has been an internal SNP affair, and I don't think it necessarily, for that reason, I don't think it necessarily has a particular bearing on the future of campaigning for independence. Because people, as I say, regard this as personal failings by him and perhaps by Nicola Sturgeon. They maybe feel they were let down by the golden couple here, but nevertheless, independence has always, for most nationalists, independence has always been seen as an issue above all. And anyway, many were deeply frustrated at Nicola Sturgeon's failure to move the dial on independence, despite winning all these spectacular election victories during the 2010s. So, I mean, her in the party, her stock had gone down very considerably. And so now people will be looking for a new form of leadership. And actually, John Swinney, in some respects, fits the bill, because I mean he doesn't give the impression of being somebody who's remotely interested in hyper consumerism, and give a fairly convincing impression this week of being utterly devastated that this figure that he's known him since he was a teenager, Peter Murrell, that all this came out has obviously been devastating to him, and I don't think anybody thinks that John Swinney is of a similar character. So I don't know what the long-term implications are for independence. I suspect, this will become part of the folklore, a bit like Alex Salmond, if you remember. I mean, there's been some incredible stories emerging in the last couple of decades, not least Salmond being accused by people in the SNP, including people very close to Nicola Sturgeon, being accused of a whole catalogue of sexual offences, which of which he was acquitted, not just by the Court of Session, but by the High Court, the High Criminal Court in Scotland, after famous trial. So there's been extraordinary legal episodes in the past couple of decades. I mean, actually, I think this is probably the most extreme, most extraordinary, even more than the accusations made against Salmond, which he always denied, and which he was fully exonerated, I should add. But it's just been an extraordinary ride. But hasn't meant that people have lost interest. Those who support independence, I don't believe that they've been particularly affected by this. And as I said, you've got to remember that despite the lurid publicity about Nicola Sturgeon, despite the lurid publicity about Salmond, despite the lurid publicity about Peter Murrell, and there's a lot of it come out, the camper van, for example, had come out long before the last election, they still voted for the SNP in very substantial numbers. I mean, the SNP under John Swinney earlier this month returned more MSPs than all the unionist parties together. That's Labour, Liberal Democrats, the Reform, the Conservatives. So there's a very strong bedrock of people who are now, they support independence, and they vote for the SNP because they regard that as the paramount issue, and are not so affected by day-to-day alarms and excursions.
Ian McWebster, thank you very much.
Okay, cheers.